So I'd just like to welcome everybody to today's call on career transitions. We've got some unique insight from our dear friend, Richard Widmann. As I said, we are recording the call. Thanks to Alice for putting it together. It's great to see so many familiar faces on the call. We will keep this as interactive as possible. So Richard's going to tell us his story. If then we have a chat, so just drop something in the chat. We'll try to call you in to ask the question live, share some experience. So comments, suggestions, tips, clarification questions, let's keep this session as interactive as possible. I mean, very briefly, by means of introduction, Richard is an incredible corporate hire with an incredible career from Coca-Cola to British American Tobacco, numerous leadership roles throughout the years. I met Richard a year ago, a year and 2-3 months ago. It's kind of Christmas time.
Yeah.
Richard,
it's passed fast.
I was where Bill is. I was in Verbier when we first spoke, and the snow has followed me here to the Czech Republic at the moment. So we really connected. A beautiful time connecting with Richard, hearing his story, and being with him somewhat through his transition. And look, we really just wanted to capture on the call today, that it's a crazy world going through a transition, particularly from a corporate position. And Richard has some unique perspective on, look, what he would do differently, some tips, some recommendations, a little bit on what he's focused on now. So really excited to hear his story.
Don't oversell. I'm not a transition expert, but I'm happy to share the emotional journey that I went through.
Look, you got to send us that signed book, Richard, as well. So no pressure on writing a book about it and making sure you send it out to us. So we'll all enjoy that. But listen, Richard, without further ado, look, over to you, and I'll come in with a couple of questions afterwards, and we'll open it to the audience.
Yeah, Mark, I would just appreciate it if you stop me if I'm going too long into a story. I just feel I need to give you a good, nice overview all the way from my personal life, which is very, very much at the base of my transition story, through the corporate career, and then what I'm doing now. So with my family, for the last half year, we're living in Warsaw. We're happily married for 20 years. My wife is Polish, so there's a bit of a background, and I'm German. I've had many good memories to Warsaw, because that's actually where I met my wife over 20 years ago. She doesn't like it when I say it that way, but we were met. So I was good friends with our CFO at that time, and she was good friends with his wife. And then all of a sudden was a barbecue party. She obviously had heard a little bit about me before. I didn't know anything about her. I was thrown in, and happily ever after, so to speak. We decided to come here specifically due to the schooling needs of our son. He's attending the American school, and the Warsaw one is excellent, and that is the sole reason. So no typical career reasons to come here. Our daughter has been in the UK for the last couple of years. She's in a boarding school in London and finishing this year. So it's the last, pretty heavily COVID disturbed, but she had great memories there as well. My career over the last 25 plus years, I could only describe it as smooth. I only ever worked for 2 companies in that time. And that implies for all the period, I never, ever really had to sell myself. The first 10 years of my career were with Coca-Cola. I made contacts with that company very early on. As a student, I already had the opportunity to do an internship in Atlanta. And also I did my master thesis as a practical work with Coca-Cola in Essen. And the career very seamlessly happened from there. I started off then in Berlin in the operations department. A year later, I was sent to Vienna, and thereafter to Warsaw as the first big international posting. There was one question mark that has evolved over these 10 years for me. Is my personal career goal was always to become a GM, to run my own business unit. And that seemed to be very, very difficult in Coca-Cola coming through the operational stream. So when then about 16 years ago, BAT came along, at that time actually via headhunter, and made me an offer to join them. And my first thought was, well, cigarettes, that's not really my kind of thing. For your information, I never smoked then, I never smoked since. And in any cigarette company, the mix of smokers and non-smokers is about the same as in general population. But it was a hard choice for me. It was not necessarily a category that I had on the radar. However, the company at that time made me a fantastic offer with all the opportunities that I was seeking. I would be switching from marketing function from operations function to a marketing function. And I would have a clear planned GM career path, ultimately all what I was looking for. And for 16 years, actually, I was very, very happy at BAT. I enjoyed very much working there. 3 reasons to give you. It's an excellently led company. Its management team is very strong. It has a great career management and the long-term people planning. So at BAT, I would have twice a year performance and career discussions. And it would be very clear where the next steps would be. And thirdly, might surprise you, but it has a very, very strong ethical framework. And it's not despite being tobacco, it's actually because being tobacco. Because the industry is under a lot of pressure. The company tended to have a very, very strong framework it adhered to. And the career ultimately that I had over those 16 years was not any short change from what I was promised early on. So I started off in London in a global role. And then there were marketing stations in Kuala Lumpur, then in Rio de Janeiro, and in Cape Town before I finally took on the general management challenges in Prague and in Budapest. So again, a very, very smooth, very plannable career that I enjoyed. And throughout this time, I had fantastic challenges that I was given. And I had the opportunity ultimately, which fits very much my personality, to work in difficult roles, to work in environments that required significant change. So changing the entire marketing function because regulation had an impact. Or in one of my last roles, completely reorganizing the business unit in Central Europe. Those are big challenges, big change management that excite me. And throughout that, I became a T30 manager in BAT. So for American terminology, this would be in the SVP level. And when the time came to say goodbye, it was for me, it was a real sudden and it was unexpected. It was a shock. For many, like for many senior careers, they end up when it becomes more convenient for the organization to separate ways than to keep going. And there are many reasons, and like have a new CEO and the new CEO brings in his own team, or there is big restructurings going on, or any other reasons. And ultimately, it feels like it's your fault. It felt for me, certainly. But it has much, much more to do with an organization than with the person themselves. So when this transition happened for me, I felt emotionally first exhausted. And for the first half, I didn't do much. I went skiing. I did a lot of sports. I did some reading. I really switched off. And one thing I did is what you would call, I floated my CV. I spoke to all those headhunters that had chased me over the years. And they were happy enough to take my calls. And there was interest, but not really anything quickly quickly happened, but it didn't bother me at that time. I felt I had a great profile and something would come up sooner or later, which actually did, but not quite what I had in mind. A friend of mine contacted me and hooked me up with an investment company, with a Canadian investment company. And this company is specialized in cannabis. Now I thought to me, what's next? Is there a weapons company around the corner? Because cannabis, I mean, probably like many of you, I grew up with having cannabis pretty much in the same drug corner as cocaine, heroin, and other drugs. I informed myself a little bit in that area, and turns out actually that there's a significant legal market evolving. When you look at cannabis, there are three big markets. One is a pharmaceutical medical market, medicinal market, which is especially growing in Germany. In Germany, for example, you can, when you are a cancer patient, you can get cannabis on receipt in a pharmacy. The second market is a little bit euphemistic now, called the recreational market, which you would call the drug market. Clearly the biggest market in Canada. It's legalized for the last 3 years now. And then there's a wellness market. And in the European context, this would be very much the hemp market. You might have heard about CBD and other elements like that. So this company had a vision to build up an operating company in Europe. And for that, they needed a strong operator to help them to run M&A opportunities, to build up the capabilities of the investees that would be putting money in, etc. And it was a good time. I certainly learned a lot about the cannabis market, and I learned a lot about the financial industry. One of the biggest learnings came when a new strategic investor came in, and the strategy changed basically overnight. From the vision to build an operating company to going back and running the company like a fund. When you run a fund, you don't need an operating team. And that was then the reason why I left that company after a relatively short time of about 1 year. So that was the time, end of 2019, beginning 2020, when I really started again to look for work and to land a job. At my stage of the career, there's always an opportunity as well to think about whether an entrepreneurial approach, doing something on my own, would be an option. I want to share that with you as well. For me, it was never really an option. And the background is just simple. My wife followed me throughout my career, throughout the world, and she has now an opportunity to invest in her own business. She was always interested in the pharmaceutical side and the medical side, and she has an opportunity with partners to open up a private clinic, which she's working on hard now. And it doesn't work very well to have two people in a marriage following an entrepreneurial calling and have two kids still going to school and university. So that was the background for me to keep working and find a job in an organization. Preferably, that was always my mindset, going back into a corporate environment. So I did all the things that people usually do. I polished up on LinkedIn. I enhanced my network. Grew my LinkedIn network from about 500 to about 1,500 at the moment. And actually, for the first time in my life, I started to apply for jobs. And in addition, Mark highlighted it already, I hooked up with him, and he started working with me on this transition period. So we seeked out various companies that could be useful for me to talk to. I had a lot of calls and followed through on a lot of potential opportunities. And in about April last year, I also joined the VAB. For the ones who don't know it, it's the Virtual Board Advisors, which I saw as a great opportunity to start somewhere down the future my non-executive career. And all I did ultimately did not return much for a long time. Obviously, there are good reasons for it. Corona didn't help. Last year, at about this time, more companies had on mind how they cut costs rather than build up their business. The second reason is I'm coming with a strong consumer background. And the consumer industry is having a structural challenge for the last, let's say, 10 years or so. You might know a professor from the Stern School in New York. His name is Scott Galloway. And I read a fantastic book of his recently called Post-Corona. And in this book, he actually lays out his thesis that we are now in the post-brand world. And we are entering the product world. And what he refers to actually is that in this new world, less brands and less heritage is what counts and convinces consumers to buy, and more true innovation, product features and product quality that convinces consumers to come in. So a classic industry for that would be beer, for example, where we all have seen the huge growth of craft breweries over the last couple of years, whereas traditional beer brands have been declining slightly, or in some areas actually quite significantly. So that's a structural challenge that I see on the consumer side. And whenever I looked into LinkedIn, I saw that the pharma industry is hiring and the tech industry is hiring, but I very rarely saw interesting consumer opportunities. And the third element is ex-tobacco doesn't seem to help a lot. I always felt it should, though, because a lot of consumer industries will face what the tobacco industry has faced over the last 20 years. There was a regulatory evolution over those last 20 years that cut away on the marketing opportunities. And the same will happen for the sugar industry, the same will happen for the fat industry, and many others. So for example, in Poland, we do see now that there is a tax on soft drinks. And I think the same has been introduced in the UK a couple of years ago. In Scandinavia, I think it was in Sweden and Norway, there's a tax on butter. So it's similar taxes like we saw on alcohol and on cigarettes before. But fact is, I felt the tobacco experience didn't help much with other consumer industries. And you can imagine it is a bit frustrating. I felt going into this transition period, going into the search, as I had stated before, I felt I had a great CV, I had a great profile, but it was very, very few opportunities coming along. And the challenge then was that for a lot of those opportunities that I had actually conversations then, quickly, many of them turned out that I was considered far too senior for those opportunities, which shut down any further discussions. And I want to tell you a little story here that I picked up from an old boss of mine. He's now the CEO of BAT. And we had a chat over a coffee some time ago. And he said, Richard, there are a number of types of leaders in any organization. And I remember two, and that those only the two are important for the story here. He said, there's a type of leader you could call a surfer. And the other one is like an apnoe diver. And to describe it, the surfer takes the current circumstances in a stride, always seemingly effortlessly, the surfer stays on top and rides the waves. And thinking that a bit further, surfers are often people who have a lot of their own interest in mind and have a very, very clear picture of what is important for them. And then there's the apnoe diver. The apnoe diver goes down and you don't see them for a couple of minutes, depending on how good they are and how deep they dive. The minutes can be longer. And they work at the basis of an organization. They change things from the bottom up. And what is important for them is typically very much to get the job done the right way. That's the most important, much more than personal ambitions. And I can tell you, when I went through this frustrating period, I really wanted to be a surfer. Unfortunately, I'm not. And things started to change for me in the late 2020, in and around the November timeframe. Mark actually introduced me to an entrepreneur, to a very successful entrepreneur and investor who had the idea to set up a tech company in the US. And he was looking for a CEO. So it was not necessarily what I thought. I mean, I'm not having much of a tech background, for example. But we had a couple of good chats, and good chemistry was building up between the two of us. And in result, we're now working on setting up that company, probably for the second half of this year. And looking at everything we're doing, I can see how my passion to build up a company, to go beyond trodden paths of standard business, how that really comes to fruition in those discussions and in the way we're setting up the company. It's not a corporate opportunity, what I was originally looking for, but it has a lot of potential going forward for myself. And you know the sentence, when it rains, then it storms. Well, you can turn it also around. When the sun shines, sometimes it's immediately summer. I began to hook up with an old friend of mine. He was a boss of mine in Coca-Cola. And we started chatting. He meantime has a web agency, and he has an interest and the passion for founding web-based businesses and then selling them off. So I'm working with him on this now as well, and I'm basically being busy in double shifts now. So feeling-wise, I'm more busy than I've ever been in the corporate world, and I do know I'm working for myself, although the rewards are largely sitting in the future. But that's the journey that I went through, and there's a lot of learnings and what I take from it. But I think Mark wants to ask the questions for that.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Richard. That's it's such an incredible story, and you're so like honest and open with it. That's so appreciated. Maybe the first question, there's questions coming into the chat already. So I saw Albert and Pablo have some questions put in already. If everybody else just wants to keep adding in their questions as well, we'll come to those in a minute. But maybe the first question, Richard, on when we spoke the other day, we spoke about if you were going to, the classic, if you were going to advise yourself, you know, a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you know, that look, a transition might happen, or like what advice would you give to yourself a couple of years back?
I think you put it on purpose, the 5 years and the 10 years, because the answer is very simple. I should have started 5 years. I should have started 10 years ago. Ultimately, I can say I took the golden cage that I had with BAT. I mistook it ultimately for certainty. And rather than building up the network in the company only, or literally only, and focusing at the job at hand, to devote my time and build up a network outside BAT, even building up a second career already through some personal entrepreneurial investments or whatever, that would have been the right thing to do. One thing I can tell you for sure, what hasn't worked for me is having a distinguished profile. That was not enough.
Thanks, Richard. And Richard, you know, we speak quite often, and the characteristic of resilience comes up, and we know that a transition, you know, is full of like ups and downs, and there's so much emotion involved in it. I mean, maybe just your thoughts on the importance of resilience to getting you through it. Good days, bad days happen, like I think, you know, greater frequency. So thinking
how to best answer that. So the most shocking experience ultimately that I went through is, you can simply put that together in a sentence. I was no longer an executive, but I was simply someone with a big sticker on my forehead, ultimately saying job seeker. And you know, when in the past, I expected people to call me. Now, all of a sudden, I needed to call people. And I went through the experience that the calls went unheeded, that mails didn't get returned. Getting back into selling myself after 25 years, and as I highlighted to you, I never really had to sell myself throughout my career. That has been extremely difficult. And I describe it as it requires a very different resilience than the resilience you develop in the job, or that I developed in the job. When I was in the job, I always felt in control, in a sense that I say, I determine what I'm working on. I can steer the course that the work goes, or that a certain challenge goes. Here I was sitting, getting up every morning, working LinkedIn, responding to people, building my network. And I tell you, a lot of days, it felt like a giant waste of my time. I remember that. That's the majority feeling that I had. You keep doing things and you keep doing the same things, and it seemingly doesn't reap any result. So it's a big uncertainty in the end, and quite frankly, to some extent, I feel it still. When the investments and the companies that I'm working on at the moment, when they come through, that will change that when the company is finally set up. But these are the ups and downs that I felt when an opportunity arose, or when someone called and said, "Hey, there's something." Those are the highs. And then you prepare for the call, and I went all the way and looked up the company and got all the details, so that when a discussion comes, that I can show some competence in the area. And when the opportunity again fell through, okay, fine. I had to pick up myself again. So you know, the other thing that's challenging is you do not know how it ends. For some people, and I have colleagues of mine from the past, they went out of the job on BAT, and next day they popped up in a different role in totally different companies, some even with a promotion. And comparing myself to them was very difficult to see what were they doing differently ultimately. But I admire those people who can transition so quickly. For most people, I can talk for myself, I think it's for most people, it will take quite a while. And it takes work. And then we got to be also clear, for some, new opportunities will not really come through in the future. And it requires then a change in tack and be flexible for other opportunities, rather than what one has in mind.
I think you mentioned that, Richard, in terms of the focus in the beginning was very much on corporate, and then as kind of time progressed and as conversations kind of came through or fell through, there was that shift into, and you said in the beginning, look, you know, there's no room for two entrepreneurs in this family, so that wasn't a route you were looking at. But then getting into that, how did you, or what was that process of opening your mindset in terms of, oh, this could be, like, I'm not in tech, but this could be something interesting. You spoke about obviously the chemistry with the investor, but I'm just curious, what was that process of your mind being opened to new opportunities?
Not sure whether I put it to a process. One of my main character traits is curious, is to be curious. Yeah. So I'm when I go to a restaurant 3 times, I order 3 different dishes, for example, because I want to try them all out, rather than saying I like this the last time, so I take it again. When those opportunities arose, there was often a lot of question marks in my mind. When you remember when we spoke about the current work that I'm doing on setting up the tech company. It's listening, and it was for me checking out what are the opportunities, can it succeed, can it work for me, is it something that can interest me ultimately. So a general openness I always had. And how do I best describe this? I have to be convinced when analyzing the opportunity that there's a long-term success for me possible. And going into something entirely new makes that not easier, like I have experienced with the investment company. I mistook it simply when such a company says, this is the strategy, that the strategy is thought through and this is what we're going to do, like I had experience in corporate. So this is a learning that I had. But I give you a story here. Spoke recently to a friend of mine in Spain, and he was considering open up a McDonald's, which is, it's a franchise. It's something you know, and if you like it, it actually doesn't pay that bad. It's in Spain, they're almost guaranteed a takeout for the owner of about 200,000 euro per McDonald's. And that reminded me of another friend who 25 years ago came to Poland, opened up his first Pizza Hut, and 25 years later, he sold his company, having acquired about 1,700 restaurants in and around Central Europe. So stories like that are also possible when you're open and say, can I make it work for myself?
That's two great stories, Richard. And I mean, before we open up and go to the questions, maybe just your top tips. A few of the guys on the call are at early to middle stages of their transition. So I'm just curious, what would be your top tips, Richard, for anybody going into it?
Well, Mark, by no means I'm selling myself as being the transition specialist. I think your capabilities are much better than mine there. But the first three topics are really technical elements, and they sound very bland. The first thing is, I repeat what I said before, network early and wide and active. Ultimately, be a surfer. Every apnoe diver out there, be a little bit a surfer. Go with the waves. The second, keep actively talking to people. Join a professional group, like I joined VAB that Mark had set up at that time. It doesn't necessarily feel targeted at a specific point in time, but quite frankly, it keeps you sane. It allows you to talk to people that are out there. It reaffirms that you're still ultimately that executive that you have been all those years. It doesn't go away just because you left your company. And it increases your reach. You meet quite a number of interesting people, and new opportunities can pop up from there. And the third is just the standard thing. You got to do the LinkedIn thing, and then don't expect much, quite frankly. A lot of people will tell you, oh, it's a great job opportunity. It's a great job boss, stock exchange, if you want to say so. Great if it happens. I can only say, other than making interesting contacts and having some nice chats, not much came from that for me. The fourth is probably important for a number of us, and certainly was very important for me. Ultimately, it means be vulnerable, make yourself vulnerable. You got to admit to people, you got to tell people that you're looking for a job. And I can tell you that was hard for me. I was much more eager and much easier to say, oh, I'm doing this, but I'm also having a plan B when that doesn't work. People will help. People want to help ultimately, but you got to be very clear what you need. And the fifth, and that is very specific for me as well, it's a human thing. You need a support and need to have a center. It's a difficult time. You go through the ups and downs. And for me, my family was my center. So I did have the support of my family all the time. I did have, I can call it the unlimited support and love that I received from my family during that time. And that showed me every day that there's something else out there rather than looking for a job. I had to do it, of course, but there's a life and the world outside that as well. And that is important.